Introducing YouTube memberships, a fun way to support the channel while getting some exclusive perks. Click the join button to become a member now and get benefits like badges next to your name on videos, behind-the-scenes photos, advantages during the live trivia game, discounts on merchandise, private one-on-one video chats, the ability to request future video topics, and exclusive 8 to 10 minute videos on the history of the NFL. And now, on with our feature presentation. I think it's fair to say that Otto Graham is one of the greatest quarterbacks in the history of this great sport. In fact, it would be hard to argue otherwise. If you're creating a top 10 list, odds are Graham is going to be in that top 10, as he's a Hall of Famer whose number is retired by the Cleveland Browns for a reason. He was named an AP First Team All-Pro 4 times, won 7 championships, including 3 in the NFL and all 4 in the AAFC, is a member of the All-1950s team, led his league in completion percentage 4 times, including each of his final 3 seasons, led his league in passing yards 5 times, led his league in passing touchdowns 3 times, led his league in passer rating 5 times, and out of a possible 71 games, won 57 of them, winning a whopping 80% of the time. Imagine a quarterback alternating between 13-4 seasons and 14-3 seasons every year. And that's what Otto Graham did with the Browns during his decade of dominance at the position. He is one of the greatest players that this sport has ever seen. And there's a reason that even though he hasn't played in close to 70 years, that he's still the greatest quarterback in Cleveland Browns history, with no close second. As a head coach, though? Yeah, not so much. There are many great quarterbacks who become head coaches and struggle miserably to make that transition. From the likes of Green Bay Packers quarterback Bart Starr, who you can learn more about by clicking the card in the upper right corner, to Philadelphia Eagles quarterback Norm Van Brocklin, who you can also learn more about by clicking the card in the upper right corner. And Otto Graham was definitely not an exception to that rule. His 3 seasons as Washington's head coach were disastrous and were full of ineptitude left, right, and center, as Washington somehow got worse in each of Graham's 3 seasons with the team. And if you want to know just how bad of a head coach Graham was, there are a plethora of moments that you can choose from, including one time where he threatened to cut literally his entire team after a game, and was about to do so before other people stepped in and made it clear that no, you cannot cut your entire team. You can learn more about that by clicking the card in the upper right corner. And as bad as that incident was, and that was obviously pretty bad, this one ranks right up there, and might be even worse depending on how you want to look at it. Because during the 1967 season, Otto Graham did something so ridiculous and threatened to protest the dumbest thing, leading to a bizarre controversy that just made Graham look like an absolute idiot and a bumbling fool. Because this is the story behind what has to be, quite possibly, the dumbest controversy of the entire 1967 NFL season, and maybe the dumbest protest in NFL history. Before I talk about the actual controversy in question, we need to talk about the player involved, why Washington coveted him so badly, and why he never actually played a game for the team. This man right here that you're watching is none other than New York Giants running back Chuck Merzine, and he was drafted by the team out of Yale in the 3rd round of the 1965 NFL Draft. The Giants were super high on him, and Merzine even turned down a pretty substantial offer from the Buffalo Bills, from all accounts, to play for them in the rival American Football League, with Merzine saying that he chose to play for the Giants because of the greater challenge in the NFL and the many opportunities available to players in New York City. The idea for the Giants was simple. They had Tucker Frederickson, the 1st overall pick in the draft, and they needed a good fullback alongside him to create a good young 1-2 punch, and they thought that Chuck Merzine could be that guy. As for how that worked out, it wasn't great, I'll put it that way. On one hand, due to injuries, Merzine actually led the Giants in rushing during the 1966 season. On the other hand, that didn't really mean a whole lot, seeing as not only were they 1-12-1 in a disastrous year that you can learn more about by clicking the card in the upper right corner, and not only did they have one of the worst rushing attacks in football, but Merzine led the team despite never scoring a touchdown, despite averaging just 3.5 yards per carry, and despite picking up just 327 rushing yards. If you're the leading rusher on your team, and you have 327 rushing yards, which rank 29th in a 15-team league, to the point where teams like the St. Louis Cardinals have 3 players with more rushing yards than you, yeah, that's not a good sign. Still, despite the fact that Merzine wasn't great, he did have his moments, especially early on in the season, and he was absolutely expected to be on the Giants roster when the 1967 season rolled around, even if it would be in a reduced role. That, as you might have been able to have guessed, did not happen. Said Merzine, "It was a shocking thing to be cut by the Giants. I was coming off my best year and had led the club in rushing. I didn't worry when I didn't play much in the preseason games. The Giants stashed him on their minor league team, the Westchester Bulls of the Atlantic Coast Football League. But after he got cut from the Giants for good after one game on the active roster against the Pittsburgh Steelers, where he did not play well despite the 27-24 win, Merzine was now a free agent, free to sign anywhere he wanted to. And that's when Washington called him up. Washington was sort of a train wreck at the running back position, so a guy like this man right here in Chuck Merzine couldn't hurt. Washington ended the season with the 2nd fewest rushing yards in the league and the 3rd fewest yards per carry in the league, and through 5 of their first 7 games, they had under 100 yards rushing, at a time when that was incredibly uncommon, seeing as the league-wide average was over 120 yards per game. In one loss, a 17-14 defeat to the Dallas Cowboys, they had just 16 rushing yards, averaging less than 1 yard per carry. In another game, a 28-all tie to the Los Angeles Rams, they had just 49 rushing yards, compared to 189 for Los Angeles, a pretty substantial difference. This offense was just not working, especially after Joe Don Looney went off the deep end for the 1,000th time, and after Steve Thurlow, who oddly enough was another former Giant, got hurt. They needed a runner. They needed some sort of spark, and it felt like Chuck Merzine couldn't hurt in that regard. So Washington decided to sign him to their taxi squad. The idea behind this move was simple. Merzine would be on the taxi squad for a few weeks until he learned the system and understood the playbook. And then once that happened, he would get promoted to the active roster. Seems pretty simple and non-dramatic, right? Well, after 2 weeks, with Merzine still on the practice squad, Washington discovered that they were not the only team that needed some help at running back after some of their other players went down. Because as good as the Green Bay Packers were in 1967, and trust me, they were good, they needed some bodies at that position. The top 2 runners on the Packers back then were, if you ask most people, Jim Grabowski, who you can learn more about by clicking the card in the upper right corner, and Elijah Pitts. The good news for the Packers was that their backfield had a lot of good bodies, to the point where by the time the season ended, they were 2nd in the league in rushing yards, 2nd in the league in rushing touchdowns, and 4th in the league in yards per carry. The bad news was that those top 2 guys of Grabowski and Pitts were badly injured. Pitts would be out for the season, and Grabowski would be out for a few games. And while the Packers had some options at running back, they only had one option at fullback, and that was Ben Wilson, who wasn't great, without even taking into account that one fullback for 1967 was awfully thin and was extremely uncommon. Much like Washington, Green Bay needed a player like this man, Chuck Merzine. And the good news for the Packers was that they could get a guy like Chuck Merzine. In fact, they could get Chuck Merzine himself. Because with Merzine on the practice squad, head coach Vince Lombardi called up the league office and called up Commissioner Pete Rozelle and double-checked to make sure that Merzine was not actually on a roster at this point. When the league confirmed that no, he was not on an active roster, as he was only on Washington's practice squad, Green Bay swooped in and took him on their active roster. Just like that, Merzine went from New York, the worst team in football in 1966, to Washington, a mediocre team all things considered, to Green Bay, the best team in the league. And Merzine loved the move, happily accepting the contract offer with the Packers to play on their active roster. Said Merzine, "I was going to be activated by Washington, but hadn't signed any contract with them when Vince Lombardi called me and asked me to come to Green Bay. It's not only the money, but the thrill of playing with a great team and making a contribution to a team that has won a conference championship." And in a normal world, this would be the end of our story, right? Let's be honest. This isn't much of a story on its surface. A man gets cut by one team, signs onto the practice squad of another team, and then another team, needing some help at that position due to some injury troubles, poaches him onto their active roster. Really? With a coach that had an IQ above 5, this would be a complete nothing burger. Except for the fact that one man was furious and enraged about this development, and thought that the Packers were cheating. That man? You guessed it, Otto Graham. Because he accused the Packers of cheating and illegally taking one of the players who was on the practice squad since they were about to call him up. Seriously. Said Graham, "Lombardi gave his word he would not do anything if we had plans for Merzine. There was a very strong possibility that we would have promoted him." In other words, what Graham is saying is that he spoke with Lombardi. Lombardi said that he wouldn't take Merzine if Graham was going to promote him, and then Lombardi did that anyway. And now, Graham is livid about this to the point where he actually filed an official protest with the NFL over this. I wish I was making that up. We'll get to how the protest went. Again, an official protest. Because as you can imagine, it was quite stupid. But let's just break this down for a few seconds before we do that. Number one, it had been a couple of weeks since this player, Chuck Merzine, was on the practice squad. You had yet to offer him a contract. If you were going to promote him, then why the heck didn't you at that point? You had ample time to do this. It's not like this was sprung up on you at the last minute. You very easily could have promoted him to your active roster and prevented anything like this from happening. Number two, what does it mean that there was a very strong possibility that you would have promoted him? You know what very strong possibility is not? It's not 100%. It's greater than 50%, and heck, it might be greater than 75%. But it's not 100%. It's not set in stone. In no way whatsoever am I supposed to just take your word, considering your actions over the course of the entire time you had Merzine on your roster, that you were even going to promote him as soon as possible. And number three, are you seriously saying the Packers shouldn't have done this because you had dibs and you were going to do it first? Are we in middle school with girls and crushes? Are we picking seats at the cafeteria table? You're protesting this decision because you called dibs? This is like protesting your fantasy football draft because you were thinking about drafting Justin Jefferson with your pick, but decided to pass on him to draft someone else. And then the next player takes Jefferson. So you protest under the guideline that you were about to do that. That's quite the argument you've got there, Graham. That's quite the argument. And when Graham protested this to the NFL, filing an official protest, oh man, the league just laughed in his face. Sometimes, protests go places and cause an uproar and create change. And sometimes, you get protests like this, where just the very nature of the protest is so laughable as to not even warrant serious consideration. Number one, there was no possible way for the NFL to even prove that Vince Lombardi promised Otto Graham that he would not poach Chuck Merzine. This is 1967 that we're talking about, and this was done over the phone. There was no documentation with Lombardi's comments in writing. There was no real way to access what happened said in transmission, and so everything would just be a game of he said, she said. But even if there was, and even if Lombardi said that, number two, when the heck did the NFL enforce oral promises between two parties? An oral promise to not take a player? Are you actually kidding me? Saying we pinky promise not to do this does not constitute an agreement. Every lawyer with Washington and with Otto Graham must have been laughing at this, that he tried to get an oral promise for a player, so a pretty hefty transaction considering how much he was being paid, as a legally enforceable document and agreement. That's just not how this works. But number three, even if Lombardi did promise Graham not to do this, and even if this agreement was in writing, guess what? Nothing about this was illegal. Nothing about this violated the NFL rules. It was completely, 100% legal to poach players from practice squads or taxi squads, or whatever you want to call them. If a player is on a practice squad, another team can poach that player, provided that they are poaching the player and promoting them to the active roster for a designated period of time. Heck, something like this happens all the time today. Every week, there are multiple news stories of players getting promoted from the practice squad of one team to the active roster of another team, whether it's for gamesmanship reasons, to try and get information out of a future opponent, or because the team just needs another body at the position due to injuries or underperformances or whatnot. This was not some obscure rule and some once-in-a-lifetime thing. This was an extremely common practice. So Otto Graham filed a protest to the league for an oral promise that was not enforceable in the slightest bit, that had no paper trail whatsoever, and whether the promise was made or not, the action in question was perfectly legal. And it somehow gets even worse, because Lombardi contacted Pete Rozelle himself just to make sure that this was a legal transaction, and that Merzine was eligible to be poached. What the heck is so controversial about this? What are you trying to accomplish? What are you trying to protest? You know it's bad, and trust me, this is the worst part. When Graham outright admitted that not only was the protest unlikely to be successful, but he didn't even know the rule that you could sign a player off of a practice squad. How do you not know that rule? How do you file a protest and not know that rule? That's like playing a game of Monopoly under protest because the opposing player left jail after rolling doubles, because you think he cheated by getting out of jail early. If you're going to file a protest, drag the great name of Vince Lombardi through the mud, and waste the NFL's time, then at the very least, know the freaking rule that you're protesting. There was quite literally nothing that the NFL could do about this. Nothing at all. Said Graham, legally, I guess there's nothing we can do about it. So what are you arguing? What the heck are you arguing about? You absolutely inept head coach. I don't even know what to say. I just genuinely don't. For what it's worth, Chuck Merzine actually played in the NFL all the way until the 1970 season, and played with the Packers until 1969. And in fact, he actually played a pretty big part in Green Bay's title run during that 1967 season, as in the team's 28-7 victory over the Los Angeles Rams in the divisional round, he scored a touchdown in the third quarter to give the Packers a 21-7 lead, making LA's chances of coming back very, very difficult. Of course, the great irony in all of this is that after the 1968 season, the man who replaced Otto Graham as Washington's head coach was none other than Vince Lombardi. Quite a difference in quality there, if I do say so myself. Otto Graham was absolutely clueless as a head coach in so many ways, and was so far out of his element that it was quite comical at times. And perhaps no moment exhibited this more than Chuck Merzine, and how he ended up playing for this team right here, the Green Bay Packers, and not Otto Graham's team. And then, Graham threw a fit, despite the fact that this was entirely his fault, despite the fact that this was 100% legal, despite the fact that the commissioner literally approved this move, and despite the fact that he had no basis whatsoever and no grounds to stand on. Because for as great of a player as Otto Graham was, he was just as bad of a head coach. If you're ever going to file a protest about something, whether it's NFL related or anything else in life, here's a word of advice based on what Otto Graham did. Think of what Otto Graham would have done, and then do literally the exact opposite. Get your official Jaguar Gator 9 merchandise by going to jj9shop.com, and be sure to like and subscribe, as it really helps the channel out a lot. Join me every Wednesday night where we'll play NFL Trivia for cash prizes at 9 p.m. Eastern over on Twitch. To learn more about the history of college football, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 8. To learn more about the history of Major League Baseball, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 7. Also, special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for helping out the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. See how you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.